go into this second segment without any interruptions with my microphone, because my microphone just decides to say, oh, I don't want to work anymore, and it's just fantastic, right? So with that out of the way, and with that microphone problem out of the way, let's go ahead and go into like what Trae Young actually said on his podcast. So he had a lot to say about NBA defenses, and he also had a lot to say about his future with the Atlanta Hawks. So a couple of quotes that I took out from his podcast were, "I just want to win. If you don't want me, then someone else will." So this is like a response to him being in a bunch of trade rumors with the Atlanta Hawks, and like because a lot of fans are like expecting him to like get traded or like maybe rebuild the Atlanta Hawks the Atlanta Hawks roster. And I don't really see him getting traded. I really see like Atlanta being able to like bring players to the Hawks, like to that organization, and to be able to play for that organization and actually like give Trae Young the legitimate help that he so desperately needs. And that's sort of been like the stipulation with Trae Young. The fact that like he's great as a player, but his team just isn't really like good enough in order to like to make the cut most of the time. He did go all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals at one point, in large part because like the 76ers choked because they had Doc Rivers. It's just what happens. But still, they've made it far. But ever since then, they've regressed. They've regressed dramatically. So, like, ever since then, they lost to the Miami Heat in the first round in embarrassing fashion. Trae Young got absolutely locked up in that series. And then right afterwards, they lost to the Boston Celtics. And here we are now, where it doesn't look like they're going to make much noise in the play-in, given how Trae Young is injured. And we'll see, like, if he's able to return before the playoffs and whatnot. But as of right now, the Hawks, it doesn't really look like the team that they have is enough to compete in the Eastern Conference. And it's sort of like how, like, even with the trade rumors, Trae Young, like, on his podcast, he said that he still wants to be with Atlanta. So, and he wants to win in Atlanta. So, with that, and he likes being different. He also said on his podcast that the reason why he joined Oklahoma was because Oklahoma, when he was in college, it never won a championship, and he wanted to try and be the first person to win a championship for that college. And it really goes to show, like, he's very different. He really wants to be different than every other like star player. He doesn't want to make super teams. He wants to be the first to do something, and you have to just admire a player like that, because the fact that he wants to bring a championship to Atlanta and he really likes Atlanta, it's something that the organization like cannot mess up. They cannot sour their relationship with Trae Young whatsoever, because now he's happy with Atlanta. But if the team doesn't win enough, he might be unhappy with Atlanta. Now, I say this because one of the quotes that he said was, "I want to win. If that's in Atlanta, that's where I want to be." So he is not opposed to leaving that organization if the organization isn't winning. And with that in mind, the Atlanta Hawks, they have to sort of do something to help him and help him win, so that way they can keep him happy. They need to start recruiting a bunch of like, not necessarily stars. They don't really need stars. Like, they do have that second option with DeJounte Murray. I'm not sure if he's going to get traded to get another second option, but he needs good role players. And Trae Young's play style and his playmaking, it's it is very good, and he can make any player on any team better with his passing and with the way he sets players up on the floor. And not only that, his scoring as well, which it's not really an underlooked part of his game, but a lot of people don't really, like, they think he's a bit inefficient in terms of scoring. And yes, like, he can be efficient, but at the same time, like, he's he's also very good at running an offense, and he's definitely like a point guard that a lot of people would want to play around. Like, I think he's better than Tyrese. Me personally, I think Trae Young is a much better player than Tyrese, strictly off of consistency. Because it's like every single year that Trae Young is on the Atlanta Hawks and that he's playing, he always averages around like 25 points per game and at least 9.5 assists. At least 9 assists he averages. And that is phenomenal, like, for a point guard to at least average 9 assists every single year, regardless of like who your teammates are. That is phenomenal. Like, and some people might argue like, oh, it's because he has the ball in his hands 24/7. Well, he can run the offense 24/7. Why wouldn't you want to put the ball in his hands? But another quote that he put on his that he had on his podcast was, "It is easier to score in the NBA than in college or in overseas." And while, yes, this might seem true, and like, actually, no, it's not, it doesn't seem true. It is true, because we see all of these players scoring 50, 60, 70-point games like it's nothing. And a lot of people like would look at these games and be like, "Oh my God, the defense is not what it was back in the 80s or back in the 90s when it was tougher." And like, maybe, like, yes, but that's only part of the story. And that's something that a lot of people like to leave out, because the other part of the defense back then was the fact that there wasn't a lot of spacing back then. So with the lack of spacing in that era, we'll just bring up a player like Michael Jordan, for example, because that's a player that a lot of people like have watched. So when Michael Jordan, like, obviously, like, back then, there was no such thing as zone defense. You could not play zone defense in the NBA. You were forced to play man. And back when Michael Jordan was playing, and when he was able to do, like, because we all know Michael Jordan could create a shot over anyone in that league. It really didn't matter who was guarding him. He was going to score. He was going to find a way to score. And with that in mind, it was really easy for him to score. However, the minute he would get by a defender, because there was no spacing and because there was so many people clogging the paint, the minute he would get by his first defender, the other defender that was already in the paint will be there waiting for Michael Jordan as he goes up for a layup, thus making the shot or making the dunk a lot more difficult for him. And once you implement spacing into the NBA, where there's not somebody stuck down there in the paint waiting for you, it just makes the looks so much easier for whoever is having the ball in their hands, because, again, there's nobody else in the paint. You just have to get by one defender, and boom, you score. So, and with how good the offense has evolved in this league, like, it makes total sense that a lot more players are scoring, because if, with the spacing, if players decide to help and not give a specific ball handler like that open layup once he blows by his defender, that means somebody is going to be wide open in the corner. And if somebody's wide open in the corner, that's a wide open three that you're giving up. And with how good the shooting is in this league, that's going to be a lot of points that you're going to give up if you constantly just drop down to the paint every single time. It's why most of the times the wing defender decides to rotate down over to the corner and to prevent that shot. But even when you do that, someone else is going to be open at the hash. And your rotations, they have to be there. And with rotations in mind, I think like that makes defense a lot more difficult to play in the NBA now, because everybody is constantly running, like scrambling, trying to find a man to prevent that open three from happening, because they can make that open three now. And back then, teams weren't shooting threes that much. They weren't making that many open threes back then. Another aspect of the game that like affects the defense is the overall pacing of the other team and their offense. Now, the offense now, compared to what it was in the 90s, is much faster. Like, back in the 90s, teams would wait the entire 24 seconds on the shot clock to get a good shot. Now, teams, like, they could go in 6 seconds or less into the offense. If there is an open shot, they are going to take it. And with that in mind, a lot of players, like, they have to make sure that there isn't an open shot that they give up. And that's a lot of running. That is a lot of moving on the defensive side of the ball. And combined with, like, for example, we'll bring up a ball handler. Like, if Luka Doncic, like, a lot of people like to harp on Luka Doncic's defense. A lot of people like to harp on Trae Young's defense. If they don't rotate, like, or if they're lazy to rotate, it's probably because they're drained from doing everything on the offense. Because these guys, like, the offense now is very isolation heavy. And it takes the breath out of a lot of these players, therefore preventing them from being able to rotate. And this is something that Trae Young even mentioned on his podcast. He said, there's so much space in the NBA, of course it's going to be easier to score. Because, like, again, like, it creates a lot of easier looks, not just for yourself, but for your teammates as well. And if it's a good shooting day for them, it's night-night for whichever team. And that's why the Pacers are so good and so great on the offensive side of the ball, because they move the ball super fast, and the teams on the defense, like, they're tired because they just played offense and they just tried getting a shot on them, and now they're expected to rotate over to the corner and guard an open three. It's a lot to ask, and it's a lot of running. And it's a lot less running than what a lot of the defenders had to do back in the 90s or in the 80s. So when you take that into account, it makes sense how it's a lot easier to score because of the spacing. And another thing that, like, makes it a lot easier to score is it's common with a lot of fans to complain about this. It's the flopping in a bunch of these NBA games, like how Joel Embiid, Trae Young, James Harden, Luka, I'm not entirely sure if Luka Doncic does it all that much, LeBron James. All of these players are perfect examples of players that try to bend the NBA rules to their will via flopping. And it allows them to go to the line. Not only does it slow the game down, but it also allows them to score a lot of points at the line because they are very good free throw shooters. And flopping back then, there wasn't as much flopping back then, or the refs wouldn't really call that much flopping. That I can agree with. That is sort of the only thing. That is the only part of the defense in the NBA back then that was, like, really substantially different and actually better, because they would allow, like, a lot of these players to, like, sort of get up on them, and regardless how often they'd flail their body and, like, sell the contact, the ref wouldn't call it. And even though, like, you know, there's some times where hand checking did get called back in the 90s and 80s, even though a lot of old heads are reluctant to agree. Yes, hand checking was called back then. I can pull up several clips of hand checkings being called on Michael Jordan. And with that in mind, it's like the fact that these refs are sort of, like, a lot more lenient to these players and flopping, allowing them to go to the line more. Like, it makes sense that they are scoring more. But at the end of the day, when you looked at James Harden's MVP free throw numbers, they fit in right with the rest. And Michael Jordan actually shot more free throws than James Harden in his MVP year. So I can't really, like, with that in mind, it's, like, a little bit difficult to say that the free throws are definitely, like, the reason why there's so much scoring. It's because of the spacing. And it's because of, like, how good the offenses are in the NBA now. Like, teams are just able to score so much easier now. And with that in mind, it's like, what more can you do on the defensive side of the ball against a team that has really good offense, like how the Pacers move the ball and how fast they move the ball? Like, it's a really difficult task. It's a really difficult task, and it's not something that a lot of these players could do. Like, I mean, expecting a player to be able to carry the entire load on the offense and then carry the load on the defense is a lot to ask with how the NBA works now. But that doesn't mean that these players can't impact the defense in some way. Like, a lot of people, like, they might look at this quote, like, and be like, oh my God, Trae Young is part of the problem by not playing defense. He gets a lot of steals. You can't expect a guard his height and his size to be able to get stops on the defense as much. So he does it in his own way, trying to get steals. It's how Allen Iverson played defense. It's how a lot of these great guards played defense, by getting a bunch of steals. And it's not as impactful as on-ball defense. It's still impactful in giving your team more possessions on the offensive side of the ball. But I digress. And with that, we are out of time for the second segment. So go ahead. And so I'm going to go and have a short break and go into the third segment, which is going to be a quick recap of all of these games that happened from last night. So stay tuned after this short break.